In this video, we're going to take a deeper look at functions and how we can create them. So recall that functions are essentially reusable recipes in R, where we can define some code that we may want to run over and over again. Those functions accept inputs, which we call arguments, and functions always return an output. So some examples of functions that we've seen are the C function, which creates a vector from the values that you pass as its input arguments. We've also seen a variety of data wrangling functions. Each of these takes in a data frame and some other arguments that specify what we want to, how we wish to modify that data frame, and they return a new data frame that has those modifications. We've also had visualization functions like ggplot and the different geom functions. And each of these, remember, takes in some arguments that specify how we wish to create a layer of a graph, and each of them then returns a layer. And we can add those return values together with the addition operator, the plus symbol, to create a complete graph. Now, before we can use a function, we have to define it. So by that, we mean that we have to specify what is the code that is to be run each time that we use the function. Here's an example of a definition of a function called greet, and we will break down how these definitions work over the next few slides. Then when we wish to use the function, we say that we call the function. And this is what we are most familiar with. We use the function name immediately followed by parentheses with whatever input arguments we wish to provide to specify how the function should be run in this particular instance. So there are several parts of a function definition that we always have to supply to make sure the function is defined correctly. So we're going to break it down piece by piece. And the first thing we need to do is we need to come up with a name for the function. So we see that written here at the start of line 1. You can type in whatever you would want as your function name. Ideally, you would want this to be different to the name of any other function you might want to use so that there's no conflict and R knows which of those functions you're trying to use. Then we have to assign to that function name as part of the definition. And for that, we use the regular old assignment operator that we've used when we're creating variables. But on the right-hand side of that assignment operator, instead of having some value, we have this special word highlighted in yellow, which is called a keyword, which is the word function. And this indicates to R that what we're actually assigning to this name on the left of the assignment operator is actually going to be a function definition. You'll see also that we've got parentheses here and some curly braces, and we'll look in the next few slides at what go inside those. So inside the parentheses, we specify the arguments that this function can accept. And each one of these needs a name. And this name at this point, when we're defining the function, is just a placeholder. Right? It doesn't represent an actual value. It doesn't necessarily represent the number 2, for example, at this point, but later on, once you've defined the function, actually want to use it, then instead of whatever this is, you would actually provide the value when you call the function. So remember, these are just placeholders for the time being. Then inside the curly brackets that you see at the end of line 1 and on line 5, we put the actual code of the function. This is what gets run every time that we call the function. And so we can have multiple lines of code inside these curly brackets. And the other thing that we can do is we can use the argument placeholder names, right? So if you've defined your function as accepting two arguments, argument 1 and argument 2, you can then use argument 1 and argument 2 inside the function's code. When you actually call the function later on, right, you will supply values, actual values to these, and then when you run the function, it would say, okay, well, what actually is argument 1, what actually is argument 2, and it would replace those placeholder argument names with those actual values. In this case, it would store it in a variable called result, which only exists inside the function. And the final thing we always need at the end of all of our code inside the function is we need to specify what is the actual value that this function should return, right? Because remember, functions always return a single value. And to specify that, the way we should ideally do that is using another function called return. And we put whatever the value we wish to return inside that function. And that's how R knows that that's the value to return. Now this is actually technically optional, right? You can, instead of using return to explicitly state what you wish to return, if you leave it out, then R will instead return whatever is the result of the last line of code inside functions curly braces. So technically return is not required, but it's always a good idea to use because it indicates to anyone reading the code, oh, this is the value that should be returned. Right? And it helps you to avoid errors when you're writing functions.